Okay, so here we go. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to our viewers to our 20th talk of the IULM FLOW circuit. Today we are going to talk about challenges and opportunities for the Italian, specifically for the Italian school system. Today we have Andrea Pastorelli, CEO of Teach for Italy, which is part of a network of 60 independent, locally led and governed partner organization for Teach for All, which is an organization, a non-governmental organization that is working to strengthen the public schools in the most difficult contest, but after Andrea will explain better, and try to bring new energy in the most disadvantaged schools. The aim is to create a movement so to interact with the growing educational inequalities. Andrea is, as I said before, the CEO of Teach for Italy, and let's cut to the chase. So I will start with the first question. Before to start, I would like to introduce you with a quote that I really like of yours, which is that you said, "We imagine a country where any girl or any boy has the same opportunities, no matter the origins or the social economic conditions." Actually, your work aiming at filling the gaps of education and at its quality and equality falls mostly under the fourth global goal of the 2030 agenda. So I'm going to ask you, what are the main inspiring acts, as the United Nations calls them, towards this goal for Teach for All and Teach for Italy, actually? And how do you operate in Italy, here in Italy, and what are the main challenges compared to the rest of the world? To you, Andrea.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, because I find myself in California. I'm connecting from California. It's 7 a.m. here. I've just had my first coffee, so it's a very different experience compared to the people watching in Italy. I'm here for an educational conference, but I'm very happy to be able to connect with you today and to be able to talk to you about Teach for Italy and Teach for All. So, as Simone, you've said, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me in. As you mentioned very briefly, so Teach for Italy, the organization I lead, is part of a network of 60 organizations present in 60 countries globally, which is called Teach for All. Teach for All was born in the 1990s, the mid-1990s in the United States, with the first of our 60 organizations called Teach for America, founded by our founder, an amazing woman called Wendy Kopp. She was at the last year of Princeton University. She was about to graduate at Princeton, one of the best universities in the world. And she realized that she didn't want to get into the private sector and immediately get a job and make some money and have a career and make a decision for what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. She wanted to have a social impact. She wanted to change the world and to do whatever she could to do her part in making sure that the world would be a little bit less unequal. She had a passion for educational inequality and education in general. And she realized that, like her, many of her colleagues at university had the same feeling. They didn't want to get into the private sector immediately. They wanted to do an experience, to do something to make the world a better place. So she had the idea of designing a program that would get the best university graduates and use their energy to have a positive impact in the worst schools of the United States. She wrote a dissertation on this. So, this is just a message to all the students watching today that your dissertations can have a very powerful impact, because 2 years later, the dissertation became Teach for America, which is now 30 years later, one of the biggest nonprofit American organizations. They place more than 5,000 young graduates into very disadvantaged public schools. So what was the idea? The idea was to create a path for 2 years, so a life experience for these young students, to give them an option, like, don't go into the private sector, don't go into a law firm or an architectural office or whatever you want to do in life, just to make coffee or make photocopies for the first 2 years of your career. Do something completely different. teach. Start from teaching, and start from teaching in the worst schools of your country, because the biggest impact you can have is if you've been lucky enough to have a good education and to have a good shot in life. The best thing you can do is to try to give this shot to other people, starting from those neighborhoods, from those local schools, from those communities where those opportunities are not there. And not only are you going to have a social impact, an important impact in those communities, in those schools, but in these 2 years, Teach for All follows you, trains you, supports you, and makes sure that you're going to have an amazing personal experience, a growth experience like no other, but especially that you learn competencies and skills that you will need for the rest of your life. Because we believe that teaching, in order to be a great teacher, you have to be a good leader. You have to learn how to become a good leader in order to be in front of a classroom, to get the classroom in front of you, to follow you, to listen to you, to make sure that they can follow the same growth path that you have imagined for them, and to make sure that you can have a real impact on them. You have to learn a number of skills and competencies that then you can use for the rest of your life in many other jobs and careers. So that's the core of our idea. Start your career by teaching. Do it with us. Do it for 2 years in the schools that need it the most. In the meantime, you learn skills and competencies you use for the rest of your life. And at the end of the 2 years, our goal, of course, is that many of these young people who do this program will choose to remain in education. And remaining in education doesn't mean remaining as a teacher. Of course, some of them love this experience so much that they decide to remain teachers because they really realize that may be their passion. But that's not necessarily the answer. We cannot change the world simply by putting a lot of good teachers in the classroom. I think that's a very important first step. But to really change our system, to change the inequality that we live and we see in our countries, we need to change the education system overall. And so we want our fellows, we call them, so the people who do this fellowship with us, to then decide to become principals of our schools, to become superintendent, to end up going to work at the Ministry of Education, to decide to go into educational startup, or nonprofits and work for civil society sector, and basically get into all the different sectors that have an impact on education and that have an impact on making sure that our world can be a little bit less equal. That's Teach for Italy. That's Teach for All globally. We do this in 60 countries around the world. This is what we do in Teach for Italy. So we do this in Italy as well. We were born 2 years ago, so we're very young. We launched the organization right before the pandemic. And we launched our first fellowship program and our first fellows into 15 fellows in 15 schools 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, with the schools closed and the country in lockdown. So you can imagine the leadership that the first 15 fellows had to show. And this year we selected another 20. So we have a total of 35 fellows in 35 schools across different regions and provinces in Italy. So we're still very young, but we are growing fast, and we have great energy and great interest from a lot of universities across Italy. And so I'm really, really thankful to be here, to be able to talk to you about Teach for Italy and Teach for All.
Thank you, Andrea, for this beautiful introduction. Actually, inspiration. It's something I learned too late on my education path. Now here in this university, actually in June, which I thank in this part of the conversation. Let's move on the another important topic of our conversation, which is the access to education, to a quality education. So talking about this, in a brief conversation we had before, we talked about the data that tell us that Italy is probably the last of the G8 having the highest level of inequality. Talking about education, maybe COVID has been an important leverage to start discussing it, for sure. But let's see your point of view. So how do you see our situation, and do you think it is actually changing? The challenges are being dealt with?
So yes, thank you for this question, Simone. This question is at the core of what we do and why we launched Teach for Italy. So Italy actually is unfortunately not just behind the G8 countries, group of countries, it's behind the OECD group of countries. Essentially, in many statistics, we are the last country in the developed world. In the group of high industrialized countries, we're lagging behind a number of key criteria in terms of educational inequity. I could talk about this for an hour, so I'll try and summarize it and give you 3 or 4 points that are, to me, are the most important ones, and those are the ones that Teach for Italy tries to focus on. The biggest worry for us is that Italy has become very fast, and only in the last 20 years, the country with the highest educational inequity in opportunity. And I'll explain what I mean. That's why as Teach for Italy, we try to focus on what we call unlocking the right to opportunities. We are a country essentially where if you come from an educated family, you will be educated. If you come from an uneducated family, you will be uneducated. As I say this, most people are like, you're crazy. It's not true. We have a public education system. Everybody has access to education, at the point of need. It's for free. And all of that is true. And it's also true that we have a great public education system. So I'm not here to criticize our public education system only. I think we have all a responsibility to protect our public education system. I'm connecting from the US, where in the United States, a lot of states don't have a strong public education system. So that was one of the biggest victories of our grandparents, of that generation. And we have to actually, our role is to strengthen it, to protect it and strengthen it. The problem is not simply the access to education. The problem is the quality of the education that our children are accessing in Italy right now. So one data, if there's one thing I want you to remember after this talk, is this. If you take 100 children who are starting elementary school this year, so 106-year-old children in Italy are starting elementary education now in these few weeks. Out of these 100 children, if all of them come from uneducated parents, so parents who didn't go to university, in Italy, only 8 of them will get to university. Out of 100 children who come from at least one parent with a degree, university degree, 68 of them will get to university. So there is a massive division between, if you come from parents who have gone to university in Italy, you most probably will go to university. Vice versa, if you don't, you will not get to university. So 2 things to just reinforce this. We have some of the lowest rates of university graduates in the developed world. We are 15 points behind some other countries in Europe, and we're 18 points behind the United States in terms of the percentage of people who actually get to university and finish university. And this is shown by all the cracks in the system before that don't allow people to get to university. So we have the highest rate of school dropout in Europe, in the European Union. Generally, nationally, we're around 12% of students who basically drop out of school before they finish high school. But in some regions, specific regions, especially in the south and in the islands, so Sardinia, for example, we go over 30% of our students who basically don't finish high school. The biggest problem, though, has been an English word that is called NEET. So those young people who are not in education, employment, or training. And we are the worst in the developed world for that. Only Greece is slightly above us, but it's complicated to actually calculate the numbers. Essentially, we have more than 30% of our young people under 35 years old who are not studying, so they're not in university, they're not working because of high unemployment, but they're also not training to gain the skills or the competencies to get another job, so to do something else. So they're basically sitting on the sofa at home, waiting for life to happen for them, waiting for an opportunity to come up for them, in a world where we all know finding a job will be always more difficult, will require very different skills and competencies that often even who goes to university doesn't have. And we're living in a global, always more globalized economy, more complicated economy, more technologically driven economy, where if you don't have specific skills, you will not be able to find a job. So it's kind of like a real catch-22 in the sense that if we don't unlock and fix some of those cracks in the system that essentially leave too many of our young people behind, we're not going to be able also to have an impact on inequality in our country. So this is the reason why we want to start from the education system. This is the reason why as Teach for Italy, we start from the most disadvantaged schools of our country, because we feel like if we want to change the system and the whole of Italy, essentially, to make Italy a less unequal place, we have to start from our school system.
Okay, but I ask you to ask you also, do you think with the influence of the pandemic, so where all the criticism, all the problems came out, and do you think something is changing? Do you see something developing? Do you see a change? Do you see something that is moving in the structure, in the system? Can we say that pandemic was a push to start
Yes,
a
yes
real?
and no. So the positive thing about the pandemic is that it pushed us to look at ourselves in the mirror as a society, as a country, and realize that our education system was flawed and wasn't working. One of the things that frustrated me a lot about Italy is that I've just told you the numbers, the data, no? So we have this situation. So the data for many, many years has shown that we have a real emergency. We have an educational crisis in our country, but nobody was talking about it. It was only something for the experts. It was something that you discussed, at conferences and policy forum, and normal kind of like the broader population were not talking about it. COVID pushed this consciousness, this general consciousness in society that something is broken. You remember the headlines, you remember, especially in the first lockdown, how the school system wasn't able to continue teaching our kids. And more than 2 million of our students were left behind like this. They couldn't connect to the internet. They had no tablets. They had no Wi-Fi connection, or they had schools that weren't prepared to kind of, really react to the situation. And therefore their families were outraged. And there was a real sense of urgency, and that's where the opportunity is. It was created, this sense of urgency that something needs to be done. And there is a global, like national conversation that everybody's having, that they want more out of our education system. And so I think that's where the opportunity lies. Unfortunately, COVID has also made all of those statistics I just talked about much worse. So I don't know if some of you have followed in the last few weeks. I think in July, the Imbalsi came out with the yearly results. The Imbalsi is our standardized tests in public schools across Italy. I have to say the government was very good. The Italian government was very good at deciding to carry out the Imbalsi tests, even through the difficulties of last year's school year. And they decided that it was important to monitor what had happened to our kids, to our students during COVID. And unfortunately, as we all expected, the results were really terrible. So we now have around 30% of our high school students who basically graduate high school and they cannot comprehend a text. We have 36% of our high school students who don't have basic mathematic competencies. So we have seen a real slip behind in the competencies of our students. This is something that has happened globally. It's not just Italy, but Italy was already starting at a low level on some of these subjects. And so we've basically realized that there is an emergency, there is a crisis. Now, in terms of what's actually happening, I think a couple of things I can tell you. Of course, the recovery plan, the EU recovery plan, is a great opportunity. The Italian government has decided to put a lot of the resources from the European Union to education, to the public education system. And so I think that over the next 5 years, the most important thing will be to make sure that those resources are well spent and that those resources are spent on the things that make the most difference. And the other opportunity is that there is a real conversation now about what we should ask out of our schools. So the outcomes of our schools. I feel like for a long time, because we have a strong public education system, most families were, I'll just sign up my kid to this school and, he's going to school. That's it. There wasn't a sense of, what should I ask and require out of that specific school? How is that school comparing to the other school? And how can I, as a parent, how can my engagement as a parent do something to improve that school? What can I do to make sure that the school can do a better job? What does the school need? Do we need to raise money? Do we need to organize a fundraiser? Do we need to put the principal in contact with somebody else to make sure that they can access resources that they don't have? Like more kind of a personal leadership perspective where the parents, the families have a stake in the school of their children. I think that's something else that I'm seeing across Italy, and I think that's a very positive impact.
Okay, thank you. Very, very clear. Let's take a few things you said to clarify some aspects to our viewers. You talked about leadership of the program, of the teacher that participated in the program. You talked about quality and talked about also outcomes. So I ask you to clarify what you imagine as a quality education and why good teachers are important and why the skill of leadership is important. You just started talking about this, but I want you to go on because we have time. So please tell us more.
Okay, well, what we do as Teach for All and in Teach for Italy, of course, we implement the same program. And while in other countries is not necessarily that revolutionary, in Italy is quite revolutionary. What we do is we train our fellows on how to teach. So we teach them how to teach, which in the Italian education system is kind of a revolution because a lot of, especially the substitute teacher, the so-called supplenti, they enter the public school system without ever having had any real training on how to train, how to teach, how to connect with the kids, how, what are the outcomes you want to see from the kids. So we believe very strongly that the competencies, the experience, but especially the passion of the teachers in the system make all of the difference. You have to be prepared, you have to have experience, you have to have been trained, but especially you have to be supported. Unfortunately, in the public education system in Italy, for a lot of young people who want to become a teacher, and they do all the right steps that are required to become a teacher in Italy, it's often a very lonely journey at the beginning. You're very lonely in this. Everything you do, you don't have a lot of support, you don't have a lot of training. So what as Teach for Italy we do is we select the best and the brightest. We make sure that they have the passion and the willingness to do this, that they do teaching. And I think that's the clear difference. They see teaching as a social impact act. So you do teaching because you want to change the world. You do teaching because you know that through teaching, you can have an impact that you cannot have doing a lot of other things. And so it's the mission, it's the reason that drives you that makes the difference. Secondly, what we do, to answer your question, is in the training we give our fellows, there's a lot of focus on inequity. So how to spot, identify, and respond to inequality in your classroom. One of the biggest mistakes that a teacher makes all over the world, and it's totally normal to do it, is that after a few classes, you just look around your classroom and you identify, okay, he's really smart, she's really smart, those three have no chance, whatever, they'll never make it. So I'm not going to waste my time on them. What we really, really focus on is, our teachers have to believe in every single child or student in their classroom. And the idea is that if you have 22 students in your classroom, you need to be able to explain the same thing in 22 different ways, because you have 22 different ways of understanding something and learning something. And so it's your responsibility to make sure that all of the people in your classroom follow you. So the classic old school approach of sitting in the chair or at the blackboard and explaining something in a frontal way, we know a lot of research shows that was basically leaving behind between 30 and 50% of children in the classroom. Basically, after 20 minutes, they were just not following. So we focus a lot on what we mean by leadership is not a personal leadership. It's not like you as a leader come into a classroom and change everything. It's we underline a lot the concept of collective leadership. In order to make a difference to our children, there's a famous book called "It Takes a Village." No, it's not a single person who can make a difference to our children. It's not even just the parents, although the parents have a huge role to play. So if your family, if your parents are not invested in your education, they don't care about your future, most likely, you will have a lot of a harder time in life to make sure that you can succeed. So what we mean by collective leadership is the role of a teacher engaging and committed to its kids, working with parents, working with the other teachers in the school, working with the school principal and the local community to make sure that the children succeed. What do we mean by a good education outcomes? The way we see it is not only, of course, making sure that our fellows, the Teach for Italy teachers, are excellent teachers at teaching mathematics and Italian and English, and we make sure that the students of those classrooms have great results in those subjects and really do well didactically and academically. What we judge our results is on the student, what we call student mindset and growth mindset. So how much have our students been able to grow in their view of themselves and in the view of themselves in the world? The opportunities they can have, the abilities they have, and how do they see themselves interacting with the world, with society, and what are their aspirations? I think if we can unlock that side of education, I think we have achieved the change that we want to see in education system.
We wish so. I agree on all line. I would talk about these topics for hours, but we only have one. So let's. I just have a couple of more questions for you. Before you were talking about instruments, so we fall into the digitalization theme, which was it's actually a hot topic right now in many sectors for the sanity, for the health system, in the circular economy, in many sectors. So, do you think that digitalization is an actual opportunity in order to make anyone have the same opportunities to access education? Do you think it was a limit during pandemic, or actually it showed an opportunity? I don't know if I made myself clear.
You did, and I think it was both. It was an opportunity and it was a problem. Initially, it was a problem, especially in Italy, because I mentioned before, our school system was not ready to shut down. We saw it in the first lockdown, we saw it in the second lockdown, but especially it wasn't ready to reopen up after it had been shut down. The biggest problem, of course, when we talk about digitalization, and in Italy, as everywhere in the world, actually, in this Italy wasn't a very special story. I mean, this is what happened in every single country, even in countries that are much more digital than Italy, like Estonia or Lithuania. I was talking to an educational expert in Lithuania, and they also had very similar issues to Italy. I mean, the biggest problem was access. Okay, so a lot of our kids, as I mentioned before, didn't have access to either hardware, software, or just connection. So the access was a real problem. And that meant that at the very beginning of the pandemic, around 2 million children, students in Italy, were left without continuing education because of the access issue. A lot was done on the access front, and a lot continues to be done on the access front. And that in itself was an opportunity, because making sure that a lot of low-income families, a lot of low-income students would have access to a tablet, would have access to Wi-Fi. It's something that I think we underestimated, but that may have a really positive impact over the next 10 years, because we have essentially accelerated, COVID has accelerated access to digital technology for a section of society that probably wouldn't have had access for another 10 or 15 years. So that acceleration has been very positive. There are still a lot of access problems. And I think one of the things that was a real failure was the inability to access or to engage or push, or sometimes maybe force, like they've done in Mexico, technology companies to do more. So there are some good practices, like Mexico, for example, in the middle of the pandemic, passed a law that forced the Vodafone and Telecom and all the telecom companies to give free unlimited data on mobile phones to any family who had a student in school. So that was a really smart idea, and basically, okay, maybe a lot of our kids don't have a laptop, don't have a tablet, and will not have Wi-Fi, but they can continue teaching, they can continue learning through their phones, through WhatsApp. For example, there was a whole national program in a number of Latin American countries on WhatsApp education. How do you keep learning on WhatsApp? And so in a lot of these countries, like telecom companies really stepped up and by giving free access to Wi-Fi or to data. And I think that's something that in Italy wasn't as strong as it could have been. So there was a challenge, of course, in access, and then there was a challenge in what do you do with that access? So we realized very soon, a few months into the epidemic, that okay, even if you give access to hardware, software, and connection, that doesn't solve it, because we realized that there were a lot of other problems. The kids we want to work with, the low-income families in this country, often they don't have a space at home to learn. They divide a very, very small apartment, maybe with 3 or 4 other brothers and sisters, with the parents at home. There wasn't a physical space where the kids could sit and actually follow a lesson or follow a teacher. So there's a space issue. There's an engagement of parents issue. And I think that's the key thing that we need to focus on more in the future. We realize that if you don't engage the families of the children or students, even high school students, even teenagers, often, digital distant learning doesn't work. The whole family has to have a stake in this. The whole family has to make sure that the kid will be in front of the screen for those 2 hours and will follow the lessons. And often that wasn't done. And so there's a lot more work to be done in this respect. And then finally, there's a whole engagement of the school system that needs to happen. So I think in that respect, yes, COVID was an opportunity, and I think it pushed forward the digitalization of our schools by 20 years. So at the beginning, you saw like teachers didn't know what to do, principals didn't know what to do. Then because they were forced, there's a lot of stories of people who basically trained themselves, try to make sure that they knew what they were doing. And then over the last year and a half, have become some, pretty good distant learning, teaching digitally. The reality, though, is that the majority of our teachers simply did exactly what they were doing, they used to do in the classroom. They did it like this digitally, as I am today. And what we saw is that that had very little impact on educational outcomes, on didactics, and that led to some of those results that I told you earlier, about the Italian school system and our students sleeping behind on a number of subjects. So I think there's opportunities and there's kind of challenges. I think the key to this is that digitalization can be a source of good. And what worries me now is that a lot of parents, especially a lot of families, are so tired of the digital component, of DAD, as we call it in Italy, in Italian, that like they don't want to hear about it. And so now anything that is digital, starting from this school year, if we're hoping that the schools will not close and will remain open, anything digital is considered bad because people are tired of digital. The reality is that's very dangerous. We should actually keep using digital technologies, even with schools open, even if we go back to normality, after COVID. Digital can play a role in making sure that our kids can learn faster, that they can learn other things, and can be an ally to normal teaching in the classroom to improve our educational outcome. It's just the way we use it.
Thank you. Actually, also the engagement problem, the engagement of parents is also another big, wide argument, but we can't face it today. We have a few minutes before the final questions. And as you mentioned, the access to digital devices, no? Because we go online, we move the world education online, but there is part of the population that doesn't have access to that kind of devices. That makes me think to one question, also to clarify to all our viewers, because we talked about equality. We talked about equality, but sometimes it comes out the term equity and then equality. So as a last question, just to clarify to all of us, actually, myself comprised, what's the actual difference between equity and equality?
There's a huge difference. They're very similar terms, but the outcomes of those terms is very different. Imagine a picture. I think there's some of you may have seen this picture. It's the best way to describe the difference. Equality is essentially when we all give everybody the same tools, the same instruments, the same opportunities at the start of life or in society in general. Everybody gets the same, and therefore we expect to have a very equal world or society, because everybody received the same tools, instruments, money, resources, opportunities, whatever that may be. And so you imagine this picture of 5 or 6 kids, and there's a fence in front of them or a wall in front of them, and they're trying to look behind that wall. So equality is when we give, and of course the kids are, one is short, one is tall, one is maybe as a handicapped, one is, a little fat, one is very thin. Kids are all different. No, you are very different kids. Equality is when you give every kid the same level of a chair. So you give them all a chair of the same height. All the kids stand on that chair and they're trying to look, beyond that wall to look at what's going on the other side of the wall. That's equality. What equality means, though, is that it's nice that everybody has the same chair, but the kid who's shorter, the kid who has a disability, the kid who has a little bit of, other kind of issues will not be able to look beyond that wall. Only the tall kid, or the taller kids will be able to use the chair and look beyond the wall. What equity looks like is very different. Equity means that each kid will have a chair that is high enough to make sure that they can look beyond that wall. So what equity looks like is we give each person the resources, the tools, the instruments, the skills, the competencies, and the opportunities that person needs in order to succeed in life. So equity is a society that really focuses on the individual to then connect it to the social aspect and like global societal progress. And that's what we really push for in our classroom. So we have a policy at Teach for Italy and Teach for All of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom, where we want to create a classroom environments where diversity is not only accepted, but it's embraced and it's seen as a strength, not only in the classroom in order for our children to learn, but so that our children can see diversity as a strength generally in society, and where equity is not only embraced, but is considered, the basic of the actions of not only the teacher, but we want a culture in the classroom where the kids themselves are pushed to think in an equity with equity lens. They put on some equity lenses and they live their life at school with an equity approach. I'll give you an example. Sometimes in our classroom, if our teacher does a good job, it is the kids who look at their companions, their students, their next door neighbor or whatever, and they basically say, he needs this, therefore I'll be sitting next to him or her and I'll help this person learn what they cannot learn. So there's a real connection, and there's a real kind of creating a bond based on equity within our classrooms as well. And that's kind of the change that we want to see. When I talked about growth mindset and the mindset of our kids, I think if we can have a next generation of students that have a mindset not only of growth and personal growth and community level growth, but also based in equity rather than equality, I think we can have an impact, and we can really change Italy for the best.
Thank you. Thank you, really. You couldn't have made it clearer. A very beautiful metaphor you used that maybe we all know, we have seen on social media. It's an image, a famous image that went around and couldn't have been more clear. So I thank you for this part. Now we read some questions. Just going to see. And Monica just okay is giving us the question on the okay, let's read. Okay, are they working to reduce the gender gap? Okay, I think the question is asking if in Italy they're working in order to reduce the gender gap, and the gender gap that is a source of inequality, of course.
Yes, I mean, we as Italy, we have, I just mentioned our our policy of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Within diversity, equity, and inclusion, the empowerment of women and girls, our girl students especially, is the center, one of the centers of our policy and of our actions. I didn't mention some of the data. When I mentioned the data, and especially on how Italy lags behind other countries, on specific subjects, there's a real division, actually. Something we're very, very behind on compared to other countries is the level of access for girls to scientific education, what in English is called STEM, so scientific and technological education. So we lag behind a lot of other European countries in terms of, the percentage of girls who actually choose that path, and the percentage of girls who choose that path who actually manage to go through that path and actually stick to scientific education and a scientific career. So we focus a lot on empowering our girl students on that growth mindset journey I mentioned before. So focusing on their growth mindset, making sure that they feel like they can achieve anything they want in Italy today, that there are no barriers in front of them because of their gender. We focus a lot on engaging the male students and committing male students to gender equality, because we believe that if we don't work with boys to as partners in gender equality, we will never achieve gender equality. So we have to work on the boys so that the boys have a view of the world and society that is based on equity and based on in this case gender equality. And then finally, we work a lot with other partners in Italy. For example, we have a partnership with Save the Children. And during the summer, we work on their summer educational centers, and we do a lot of activities focused on girls, and especially girls in STEM education. So we're very much focused on this subject. If the question is broader, what Italy is doing on this, I have to say that those European Union funding, the EU Recovery Plan, a section of the funding that will be invested in the next 5 years on the education system is focused on gender equality in schools, and generally not just the portion that will go to education, but there's a real big section of that funding over the next 5 years is based on gender equality. So there is I think a once in a lifetime opportunity for our generation over the next 5 years to push these issues for sure.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. I took too much of your time, so I'll let you go have your second coffee of the day, second of many, I think. You started very early today. So I thank you, Andrea Pastorelli, CEO of Teach for Italy. It was a very clear and wide point of view about this topic. Thank you, all viewers, and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening to us, and have a good day or good evening in Italy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.